All right, we're live. Welcome everyone to our stream. Sorry we're late. We had technical issues, or specifically I did. And we're waiting on Cam for a second here still too. He should be joining any moment. Of course, we had the SEC championship game, so you got to watch that. And I was gonna pull up the Big Ten championship and watch that on stream, but I don't know, maybe we'll get this out of it in a second and watch it in the background. But we are doing part 2 of this live reaction for Case for Christic Liberalism with Sean Luke. That was on Javier's channel. And the first half, you can go watch that on our channel. It's something similar titled to this stream. It's the last live stream we did. And we responded to Sean Luke's main presentation. And then the second half, Sean Luke goes through coercion and government fostering public virtue, hopelessness and defeatism, race and ethnicity issues, consensus of antiquity issues, and then some smaller topics at the end and a conclusion. So we're going to try and get through some of that on this stream. Maybe we'll see if we get through all of it or not. Depends on how much we talk, I guess. And we did 1.25 last time, and the audience seemed to be good with that. So I think we're going to continue with that same speed. So let me share here, and then we can go ahead and get started. Have you guys watched the second half? I haven't watched the second half.
Just bits and pieces of it.
I have not. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah, I've only watched the amount we watched on last stream, so this is where we ended last time. So we'll continue from there, I guess. Oh, no audio. Let's fix that. Let's see. That's strange. Usually, like when you present a oh no, but no, I might need to do. Let me try something. Let's present. Do I need to present an entire? Let's try this. Is there audio this time?
And so,
yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Christian nationalism, as you mentioned in your presentation.
All he said there in those 2 seconds was, "I'm going to go on to the questions that I have." So,
further detail. And so, according to proponents of Christian nationalism, as you mentioned in your presentation, the government is for the fostering of public virtue, even if that necessitates coercion, as you just mentioned a second ago. So could you please flesh out for us a little bit more in detail what that vision for government looks like historically, and then tell us what its its ultimate falling short?
Yeah, so as mentioned, Plato is a great source for this in terms of legislating, essentially. So Plato, he implements censorship of certain forms of art because he thinks these are actually not good for the soul, they're not good for the public spirit. Aquinas, of course, then takes that up into the Christian tradition. Now, historically, where this gets interesting to my mind is Aristotle doesn't necessarily say that one should legislate virtue under the threat of coercion. So while Aristotle does believe a state should be ordered towards public virtue, and the purpose of a good state, well regulated, is that it directs its people towards public virtue, he does not actually say that the state should then, under the threat of the sword, enforce virtue. That's a very significant, and that's the way a lot of Christian nationalists sort of claim Aristotle in his camp. He's not. He actually goes on then to legitimize a bunch of different sorts of kinds of governments. So Aristotle legitimizes, he thinks oligarchy is a legitimate form. He actually even thinks tyranny is at least a form of government, even though he thinks it's a bad form. That's what even though he thinks it's a bad form, he thinks it's a form.
I think Aristotle being silent on an issue when Plato said something doesn't mean Aristotle was against it. And maybe I'm just missing something in Aristotle, but I don't know.
Well, you have to think about what does it mean to coerce virtue in the first place. I mean, Aristotle's going to say virtue is something that's, it's a habit. So it's just by nature not the kind of thing that one can coerce. So it's a vacuous point that he's making.
Yeah, because you could coerce individual particular actions, but not the habit itself.
Exactly, and you may need to coerce actions to build virtue.
Yeah, that's
could be part of it.
Yeah, and even if Aristotle didn't necessarily lay that out as something that is needed, it sounds like Sean's just saying he's like silent on it, which doesn't necessarily mean he's against it or for it. It just means he didn't say he happened to not say anything on that question. This is kind of just you'd have to speculate if you wanted to get at it or look at his followers to see what they went with.
But for Aristotle,
I guess.
He wants to say that the legislation should, in general, according to the constitution of the state, so he actually thinks also virtue is adaptable to the constitution of the state, should be oriented towards public virtue. So I'm sort of then saying, okay, look, like that's a thread I actually don't disagree with. But I'm arguing that actually the best way to facilitate public virtue in the saeculum is actually to secure, at least when we're thinking about this, the coercive power of the state, is to actually facilitate political freedom. Because otherwise, my neighbor's not going to, they won't freely submit to Christ. They might do it under coercion, and if they do, it's a grace. But the state isn't conducive to that. It's not conducive to the free submission and the free participation in the life of God. So that's where I would point out that first, historically, Aristotle's not unequivocally in your camp on this. He doesn't think that, even though he thinks a common life should, and a legislator should sort of fix a common life with a view to virtue. And so I was sort of getting the Christian nationalist perspective when I was reading that quote. But in that reading, that's actually a very key phrase, with a view to virtue, not that they should implement virtue by law. And so he wouldn't necessarily go where Aquinas goes, to my mind. Now, that means then that as we're looking at the traditions of political history, the way the legislative coercive power of the state relates to the implementation of virtue is variable. And so that has to be secured on other grounds than just saying, well, this is what everyone thought, because it's just not. And those other grounds I've suggested are theological ones, which enable the church to be the church in the saeculum.
So how can we distinguish?
Anybody have any comments on the end of that question there? Welcome, Cam, by the way. The question was along the lines of, how do you best get public virtue, whether it needs to be coerced or not? And Sean is contending that Aristotle doesn't or is not in line with how Christian nationalists frame how that should be done.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, is essentially his position that like coercion is not the best way to, create public virtue?
Yeah, he says instead you should have. He said seems to be contending for freedom being the best way to get public virtue.
I would say it's kind of a mixed bag. I think a limited amount of freedom is instrumentally useful for public virtue. I don't think freedom as such, like unlimited freedom or whatever, is ultimately. Which I'm not saying he is saying, but I think he is mostly adopting this like negative freedoms framework. I think, yes, it is true that you probably do need like people being able to, sit down in their homes and be able to like write treatises and stuff without, being, having someone looking down their, shoulder every minute. Right. But at the same time, and I think for the Lutheran understanding too, like our view is that effectively civic virtue is this, set of virtues that cohere to, external public peace, right? And they're not, in a manner of speaking, you can even say there's a sense in which they're not even true virtues at all, right? Because they lack this orientation which they ought to have. But, by the same token, what we would say is that, there probably is a limited amount of freedom, to gather my thoughts here. Like a limited amount of freedom, I think, guarantees that. But, if it is just, a broad like adherence to, certain roles in order to keep the public peace, I don't see why that couldn't be coerced, is what I'm saying. Like, it seems like you actually could coerce people to, I don't know, not say, blasphemous things or something, right? Like, I don't see any reason why that's, outside the purview of government.
Yeah.
On this framework.
Well, I think how Sean, like in the last video, defined freedom is like basically anything goes as long as it's not like a rights violation. So you have like freedom without any.
That is how I framed it roughly.
Yeah, and so like one of the things I would actually want to argue against Sean is like in terms of coercion can actually help the advancement of public virtue or virtue in general in society would be to outlaw things like perjury or defamation, because if you think wisdom and truth and, you know, charity in terms of treating people innocent until they're proven guilty is a virtue that society should attain to, then the government should outlaw things like lying under oath or defaming people's characters publicly, because you know, that just makes for a chaotic society and it makes it very difficult to find the truth. Even though neither of those are inherently rights violations, but
Yeah, I mean that actually is an interesting part of his model because I do think this like negative freedoms, you know, view that he's espousing probably goes a little stronger than Locke's view precisely. Like I think Locke does have some concept of positive freedoms, you know, on some of these questions, yeah, like things like, you know, frauding others or speaking ill of them or, you know, defaming them, right? Like this actually is an interesting thing, which, you know, to cite Murray Rothbard again, you know, like Murray Rothbard says that you just don't have a right to a reputation, like you just don't. Yeah, like presumably I would say on any sort of, you know, positive rights tradition of civil governance, right? Like, why not? I mean, you know, I think presumably that, you know, there's a good argument for saying that, you know, if I'm a baker and if this person says that, you know, I'm I'm poisoning my cakes, you know, I have a right to potentially, you know, adjudication.
Well, yeah, because your reputation, especially if you're a businessman, kind of is your livelihood. And so, like, when someone slanders your character, that actually directly affects your actual livelihood, just like stealing would. So,
Yeah, a couple other things. Like, first of all, there's going to be some people who aren't capable of every virtue. Slaves don't need the freedom sufficient to write a treatise because they're not fit for it. They're not fit to be citizens. So Aristotle acknowledges that some people by nature can't participate in virtue to the fullest extent. So if we want to go all in on Aristotle, we can do that. Secondly, there's more at stake than just can we foster virtue. So the reason that I want to coerce people not to murder is not because I'm particularly concerned that they develop, you know, temperance. It's because I don't want people to die. So all the best to the guy who's waving the gun around. I'm going to coerce him to not wave a gun around so that other people don't die. It would be nice if he would develop temperance eventually, and it would be even nicer if my coercion could help him develop that. But I'm not really focused on that right now. It's the same thing with blasphemy, right? If I would love it if everyone would freely, out of the goodness of their Arminian hearts, just not ever take God's name in vain. And I would love it even more if my blasphemy law would play a role in that. But what I'm mostly concerned about is that we don't have to listen to your nonsense. The rest of us people who are actually, you know, worshiping God. So that's how that seems to me.
Yeah. Speaking of, Cam mentioned what the like Lutheran view is, or like our theological traditions view. I didn't plug this at the beginning of the stream, but I did plug it in the last one. That we do have a compend that is in the works on the Lutheran Orthodox on the political magistrate. So we will be publishing that in the future for everyone. So I'm not going to do a long plug or something, but just so everyone knows about it.
Between the ends the government should pursue. Why should the government be uninterested in other ideals besides freedom, aside from obviously indirectly willing these ideals alongside freedom? Because you mentioned political freedom quite a bit, and I feel like you know, at this current moment that we're in, a lot of people. This is an aside, I guess. Maybe you can tie this into your answer.
Yeah.
A lot of people are very sort of dissatisfied, right? Like people are looking around, they're seeing a lot of whether it's in the sexual realm or in any other kind of moral realm, people are very dissatisfied, and they're kind of looking around restless, saying like, well, if this is where pursuing political freedom has taken us, then maybe the government should be interested, right, in pursuing these other ideals. And so, why should the government be uninterested in those other ideals outside of indirectly willing them alongside freedom?
Yep. That's a great question. So when we're thinking about willing and ordering the government towards political freedom, that's important and that's why I mentioned two ends of the state, one with respect to the coercive power and the non-coercive power of the state. With respect to the coercive power, the reason I'm arguing the government shouldn't be directly ordered towards anything else is because the moment it is, that's going to result in violence and coercion. So coercing people towards Christ through violence and it's going to actually result in Christians killing Christians. Here's how. I would say, and a lot of us that are paedo-Baptists would say that a Baptist refusing to baptize their baby is actually a bad thing. That's sin. That's a form of low-handed sin. Even if it's done in good conscience, it's still not for them to do justice to their child.
Yeah.
I would hate for the state to become such that someone like Gavin then comes under the knife. For that. That's pretty awful. And the thing is, that's not just theoretical. That actually is what Locke and Mill were responding to. Is that Locke had just come out of the period of the Glorious Revolution, right? So Cromwell, kind of in a bloody way, tried to overthrow the monarchy and implement Presbyterian government in England. Lots of violence, because he was convinced that, well, the government is for the enforcement of public virtue. These Anglicans are like semi-papists, and so they need to be dealt with, right? That was his thinking. And if you think the government sort of has a blank check, or even like largely even a public check to publicly conform the polis to the life of God, well, then Cromwell's reasoning makes sense. And again, it wasn't unique to him. He was pulling on other thinkers that in both Roman Catholic and Protestant that just thought like that. I would say that's a really bad. That's not a good thing. If we think that someone like Gavin is saved, then we should. Then what you're literally doing is authorizing Christians to kill other Christians. And again, this happened. And so I think I look back on that period of history and say, look, that actually is where that sort of that vision of the government's role is to legislate virtue at large, to conform the people to the life of God. That's where that gets you. And then secondly, when I'm thinking about my non-Christian neighbor.
I think on this point, I don't know if I discussed it on the stream last time. I actually did discuss this very briefly on the other Pulse stream last night. I was like kind of half in the stream. I was in the middle of working out, but I don't think necessarily that you have to. I don't think you have to have a liberal framework to say that you can have an amount of religious tolerance. You can have, situations like the 30 Years' War, and you can have a solution to that involves an amount of tolerance without just having, a liberal framework. I don't think you have to have a liberal framework to get there. We did talk last time about, Augustine and Aquinas on harlotry, right? And how, I don't think any of us agree necessarily with what their ideas on that, or maybe someone did. I don't think any of us did, but the idea that you can tolerate certain things in your society without having to have a liberal framework. You don't have to have necessarily laws for every single moral issue that you have to try and enforce top down. There are pragmatic things at times where you don't necessarily need that. If keeping the society at peace requires some amount of religious toleration, then the state also has the end of keeping things at peace. So there's an amount of pragmatism there.
Yeah. No, exactly. And, I mentioned last time Jeremy Taylor's work on the liberty of prophesying. And there were, I would consider Jeremy Taylor not a Lockean. And he says that effectively, well, since this is a matter of the soul and not the body, right, it doesn't make much sense to coerce via the body. And I think that people can have differences of opinion on that. And that's the issue I have with this entire framework, is that as I see it, Christian nationalism is more of an idea than a set of policies. So I think as an idea, it effectively says that the Christian magistrate, in theory, does have, the jurisdiction to, punish all sins and to promote all virtues. That doesn't mean that he's not going to have to pick his battles, right? Like ultimately he's going to, and ultimately speaking, he is going to be the magistrate within a particular framework. And if he's the magistrate within a Democratic or Republican framework, that's going to be a factor. So like in the American framework, I think probably the most you can get is, something like, the tradition that you found in the late 1700s to the mid 1800s of there being state churches, right? And things like that. I don't think you're going to get much more than that. Maybe in some other places you are going to have more rigorous frameworks. But I think those are debates that are going to be had. And as I said in the last stream, I think that political science is an inductive science, and you have to see what works and what doesn't. Maybe it is just the case that the 30 Years' War showed us that it's not a good idea to persecute people to the utmost. Well, you learn from that, and you decide to incorporate that within your framework. By the same token, what you could say, and I think very persuasively, is that, well, we should learn from this liberal experience, like this liberal experiment, that, mass degeneracy is one of the ends, and so maybe we have to actually think about that too. And so both of these things, have to, I think, be pondered.
Yeah, I mean, the baptism thing, we have historically, if you want to talk about American history, we have solutions for that. If you're like living in Massachusetts or something and you want to say no baptizing babies, you can go to Pennsylvania and be an Anabaptist. It's not like the federal government has to make a policy for the entire United States on baptism. So it's just like I don't know what fallacy he's committing here. Also, is he talking about Gavin Ortland?
Yeah, I think so. When he said Gavin,
yeah.
So.
He's like, I wouldn't want to put Gavin under the knife. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
well,
Gavin
I mean,
Ortland.
he's entitled to his opinion. So, Tony, you can go.
Disavow. Cut the stream.
Yeah, so what I was gonna say was like Sean mentioned in the last stream, like gradualism. And so like the Christian magistrate can kind of meet society where they're at and kind of, make the laws that's gonna not make society collapse, but try to also promote virtue in that context. And he can also use his wisdom to look at history to see what worked and didn't work, like Cameron said. Abraham Lincoln has this famous quote where he says, if you want to find out if a law is bad, enforce it as strictly as possible. And so, it's Cameron pointed out, like maybe, persecuting, religious difference to the utmost might yield some bad results. And so maybe the Christian magistrate can be like, well, there's so much diversity. Maybe we can be a little bit more lax on the federal level. But as Noah pointed out, like states can still have their rights to where, like states right now in America actually regulate their own morality. We actually see that with the overturn of Roe v. Wade. Some states ban abortion while other states allow it. And there's no federal ban technically on murder. It's just all 50 states ban murder. So, states regulate their own morality. They just have to adhere to the Constitution when they do it. So
I do think baptism in particular is like maybe not the best example either, because I mean, like if you're going around, like if you had a very if you were like in a if you were in Germany and where like it was the German Lutheran states, and everyone was the vast majority of people were confessional Lutherans. I'm not actually sure that like persecuting people for not baptizing babies would be a good state policy, anyhow, just for pastoral reasons, because like if the family's not going to raise them in the faith, that's like then it's actually bad to baptize them. So it'd be actually bad federal law, probably not actually in line with Lutheran doctrine of how you should run things. But mandating church attendance is would actually be the opposite situation, where it would be in line with Lutheran teaching to say no, you do actually have to attend church, and we can legislate that. And I believe some provinces in Germany did indeed do that, and that was the policy of some of the Orthodox Lutherans. So, baptism may be like a tricky example, but mandating church attendance is not.
I'm pretty sure that was the case in England as well with the Anglican Church. They made a law where you had to attend the Church of England, I believe.
I think you might be right. Don't quote me.
Yeah. So they had like ways that you could kind of get around it, but yes, like in theory, it was kind of mandated.
And I think in certain situations, it's like you could enforce it. You could enforce more distinctives in some ways, and there's pragmatic times that where it's probably a good idea to enforce more things, and pragmatic times where it's probably not. It just depends on the situation. But I think you could enforce, if you had a situation where you were like in, 1600s Germany or something, or 1500s Germany in certain provinces, you could enforce more or less Lutheranism maybe not necessarily to the utmost on every single thing, but on a lot of things, you probably could.
Right.
You had a
Any other comments? No, go ahead.
If
no, I was
the-
Okay.
The church
go
has
ahead.
this disposition of the free offer of the gospel to the world. How does her existence as the icon of God's free offer make sense? How is it intelligible if she's also saying to the magistrate, kill those who oppose us, right? Kill those who are rejecting our witness. At that point, she's actually not preaching, forgive them for what they know not what they do. And she's not bearing injustice so that they would be saved in the day of the Lord. So then the form of life she's called to have no longer makes any sense in the context of the state. So those are the grounds on which I'm arguing for this. I forgot there was another part of your question that I just
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that's very well said. I feel like sometimes people get caught up in again the dissatisfaction of the moment and saying, well, how can we make things better? And they don't. A lot of the time, people don't consider the cost. I feel like, and again, I'm not on this particular issue as historically literate as I want to be. But even then, right, I'm well aware of how many Credo Baptists were drowned, right, or were imprisoned historically. People don't seem to be very aware of that. There seems to be in some circles this sort of idea that like, well, guys, we'll have like which is so funny because these are the same circles that would condemn this in other scenarios. But there's almost like oh, guys, we're gonna have like a mere Christianity. Christian nationalism, and it's like, in what sense is this sustainable, right? If we're coercing people, and it's under the pain of the sword, then at a certain point, right? Like once it may be in this sort of like purity spiral. It may be that in this hypothetical, oh well, it starts off with other religions first, or it starts off with atheism first, or whatever, and then now it's just Christians. Yeah, but once it's all Christians, again, to your point, right? And I know Presbyterians personally, like friends that I have who are in this camp, who will say that, or at least people that I know, who will say that a Baptist should be drowned, or that something like this should happen. These are Christians that we're talking about, right? Because what happens is once you get to this like next level of purity, then it's but guys, we need to reach like the purest level that we can get to as the church. And of course, if you're a part of any given tradition, as everyone should be, whether you're a Presbyterian or Anglican or whatever, of course your idea is going to be, well, my tradition has the fullness of the faith. And so once we've gotten rid of all these other really bad things, I just don't see how people fail to see that this will inevitably turn into, well, how do we get rid of all the people that disagree with the fullness of the faith, as I understand it?
So is the critique just that we would end up with like, a Lutheran Orthodox society eventually? Is that the problem? Is that the concern? I mean, now that seems pretty nice. I do think maybe I do think there is some issue on how theological triage is being done here, because I mean, I don't think like Luther would be comfortable with just being like, oh yeah, all those Anabaptists are just all Christians. It doesn't seem to be Luther's perspective on this issue, or the Lutheran Orthodox. They definitely question the salvation of some other Christian denominations, more or less, depending on how much error they have, and depending on how much culpability there is, and the station of the individual. But I don't think it's the Lutheran position to just be like, they are all Christians, full stop, and then just put it there and be like, well, we're killing Christians, so therefore we shouldn't do that. It doesn't seem to be the positions our dogmaticians took.
Well, I will say, and this is interesting and I think worthy of note, as Tony pointed out last time. This actually, I think, kind of proves like our point that this actually would just be something that was debated. It actually just was debated in our dogmatic tradition, right? There were dogmaticians who thought that this was okay, and there were some who didn't. Right, and those debates would be had. Actually, ironically enough, someone like Walther in our own tradition, who we're not totally on board with necessarily on all these questions, but if the LCMS asks, we are. But like he would not be a liberal, but he would also say that essentially you shouldn't coerce virtue out of people, and these are questions that I think would be asked in a Christian nationalist society. And I mean that's the problem I have, is that I think he's working with an extreme example. And he's saying that necessarily is going to be the case in all societies subsequently. And I'm not convinced of that. And I think even if it were the case, as Seth was pointing out, you probably wouldn't end up with, wholesale sort of let's just kill all the heretics, right? You'd probably end up with a mediating position. The Anabaptists are kind of a interesting example, as I'm sure y'all know, in that they actually did have an aspect of their ideology that was very anti-statist, right? And that actually is what I think further complicates this. Maybe you can say to a degree it became like group by association, because guilt by association rather, because some of the latter Anabaptists were actually pacifists. But it took a long time for this sort of extremist Thomas Müntzer sort of mentality to wear off.
Yeah, and there's a difference between publicly spreading a heresy and just holding it. Like, none of our dogmaticians that I've read so far say like that the state should be punishing with corporal punishment anyone who's just a private heretic or even just like casually living their life in a heretical sect. They are always speaking about people trying to spread it and proselytize or publicly preach it in the literally from the box in the public square at the time.
Yeah.
These are different things.
Another thing I've noticed in some of our dogmaticians, at least, is that they'll have, their judgments on culpability will be like on the preachers in those heretical sects more so than the lay people do.
Yep.
So that's another thing to consider as well.
Yeah. As far as the go on, Cameron.
No, I was just gonna tell Seth to put Javier's clarification up on.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't looking at those comments. Yeah.
Yeah. Go on, Noah.
Okay. Yeah. All I was gonna say was, I believe Zwingli drowned Anabaptists. I don't think Luther did. I think Luther actually wasn't a fan. And that said, there's sort of a, oh no, these poor Anabaptists were just sort of operating like in the realm of pure reason and theory crafting, and they just happened to get it wrong. How dare you? Well, things are more complicated than that. There's political realities. There's, revolutionary spirit. So this isn't just, they're not just on a YouTube stream and then the one guy says something wrong about baptism on stream and so we go drown him. Let's not. And I also think that Javier's point here is good. I actually don't know that a whole lot of, and maybe I'm just out of the loop here, but I don't know that a whole lot of Christian nationalist folks are out here saying we need to go out and drown Credo Baptists. Like mostly this is about like Indians having us do like yoga in our big tech meetings and like Muslims coming in. I don't know. I think everybody pretty much in the Mere Christianity spirit agrees that there are more pressing sort of analyses that we can run other than that the baptism thing.
I do think I think you could have a sort of Mere Christianity Christendom for an individual like nation or empire in a sense. Like yes, there have to be some borders to that eventually, right? Like our Quakers Christians our oneness Pentecostals Christians. Like you'd have to set some boundaries, but like I think you could have like a roughly creedal, like meaning like the Nicene Creed or something like that. Groups that are within that camp of generally Christian orthodoxy. Somewhere in that direction, and you can just have moderating positions, and it's just going to depend on the nation and the state and the empire and whatever situation it's in. Like there's going to be an amount of inductive reasoning going on to know what the most pragmatic policy is, I think you could have that. It just depends on the situation, and it might shift with time, just depending on the nation. It's going to be different based on different situations.
It'll be Protestant. I think that Catholics might be on the outside. They can go, to South America because they're so proud of how they're growing down there. They can, but America can be Protestent. Like,
or they can go to Canada. Has plenty of Catholics too. They can just go up to Canada or down to Mexico. I mean, you don't even have to leave North America. You can go to either border of the U.S.
That's right.
Either direction. Both are Catholic realms. So you can go to either of those. The U.S. is historically Protestant. It can be broadly Protestant, and that's what it could be. And individual states can be different things. If Missouri wants to be Lutheran, they can be Lutheran.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Anyhow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for the record, I assume Noah was joking with that.
Yeah.
If you want, room to clarify, here's your time, Noah.
I do not endorse the execution of Gavin Ortland. There we go.
And the sad thing about this is our forefathers had an excuse in that, like when Christendom happened in Europe, like that was the first time it happened. We don't have that excuse anymore, right? Like we can look back on history and say that led to a lot that was really problematic. And of course, against our atheist critics, like I would also say that wasn't a uniquely Christian problem. Like that was a problem the way people thought about government. But nevertheless, that is where that goes. That inevitably, because if we think the government again is for the assimilation of the community to the life of God in its coercive power, well, then you're going to have, if we think, again, as I think we should, and I think this is true, that Baptists refusing to baptize their babies is actually a bad thing, well, then you're going to bring in the state to actually deal with that. And that's a bad way. That's going to end up setting Christians against Christians. John 17 goes out the window. Then, of course, when I'm thinking about the witness to the world as well, I messaged you actually in Facebook Messenger that quote from Lactantius in the Divine Institutes in Book 5. Where Lactantius, interestingly, I thought this was so, I just came across this like today, actually. I thought it was so interesting. For him, when he's writing to the emperor and defending Christians, trying to get the government off their back, off of persecuting Christians, he's like, look, we don't get angry, which is so interesting. He's like, we don't get angry at other people for insulting our God. We trust it to the vengeance of God, that God will actually deal with that. And so he's actually really explicit that he's not saying that the governor and the government. Now, one might say, well, this is because Lactantius is being prudential and Christians aren't in the majority yet. That's not his reasoning. Lactantius's reasoning is that we trust it to the vengeance of God and bear insults consequently, and we're not going to make a stir of things. Which I think really that's an example from actually church history that shows the church fathers were not a monolith on this either. You have, of course, people in this sort of CN camp. Eusebius, arguably, is sort of in this camp. Augustine is actually more complicated. Because he starts in his controversy with the Donatists, he actually starts by saying, no, the emperor shouldn't. But then by the end, closer to the end of his life, he actually advocates then for the emperor to use the sword against the Donatists. A part of me thinks it's probably because he was tired of arguing with them. But he doesn't at first. So he's a little bit more complicated. But of course, a theonomist could claim him. Okay, but they can't claim Lactantius. And they certainly can't claim Justin Martyr, who actually is advocating for Christians to just have the freedom to worship. He's not advocating for. He doesn't come close to saying, "Well, actually, Emperor, you should persecute those people who are worshiping Zeus."
Yeah. Well, and we see again just the occasion for sin. Also, again, even with the proto-reformers, for example, with Jan Hus, where he's promised safe passage, right, to what was supposed to be a debate, or was supposed to be at least a conversation about the issues. And what happened? The authorities were pressured by the church to actually seize him and let's put him to trial. And then we see again arguments that are made about hey, it's actually okay to lie to heretics, right? And we're gonna put this guy to death. And again, I think it would, for as we'll talk about here in a minute, for people that are talking about being historically rooted and thinking about history, people don't seem very keen to look at the pitfalls of history and learn from them.
Yep.
And funnily enough, that's we've been making that point about perjury for 2 streams now, and somehow this is lost on the conversation here that perjury is not some violation of rights. And yet, the example that was just used was that the government should not commit perjury. In the case of Jan Hus, that is, by lying under, I guess it technically maybe it wasn't under oath in the strictest sense, but if the government's saying they'll grant you safe passage and they don't, that's, effectively perjury.
Well, yeah, a lot of these things are, I think, to be a little more serious, they are case by case things, where we are right now in current year. We do need to think about being wise in terms of our coalition building. And I really don't think, we need to deport people for being Credo Baptists. And, but let's be careful before judging Cromwell or whoever else, who are in a very different political situation.
100%.
Yep. I think that's exactly right. Now to address that second part of your question, people feel hopeless now because they're looking at the progress of culture. So culture, for instance, might you might get sanctioned in certain places for not being pro LGBTQ plus. In Canada, for instance, right? If parents they don't want their children to transition, the state comes down on them, right? Well, I think the answer to that is twofold. First, of course, if political freedom is at stake here, the government wouldn't do that. I would argue that because the government is obviously post-nature, right, or it's something that's a consequence of nature, the government can't oppose. It doesn't have authority to oppose any of the structures of nature, to legislate against those that Christ has set up, which includes the natural bond of parents and children. It includes then the consequent obligations and authority that parents have over their children. So I think on those grounds, again, Christic liberalism can still say critique the state and say that that's wrong. But then we have to also be more creative, I think, because to say that we should just look at what the left is doing, and therefore we should just like put in coercion and like that actually is a really dramatic lack of creativity, because there are more forms of political participation than just coercion.
Well, and it's not just a lack of creativity. There's something that I actually want to harp on for a second here, which is it's just defeatism. It's something that I still like. I do not understand this from the conservative side, especially from not from a Christless conservative perspective, but from a perspective of a Christian who's a conservative. I feel like I have conversations with people sometimes where it's like defeatism about, for example, oh well, we'll never get a national abortion ban, and so we might instead go for the. And I'm like, does the other side ever think like this? They never stop to think, well, actually, we could never convince people that men can become women. The other side doesn't do this, right? The other side doesn't say, well, actually, we could never convince people that the baby inside the womb is not a baby, or that you could get rid of him moments before. They never think that way, right? They infiltrate the institutions, they write papers, they put stuff in the media. All of these different things happen, and the other side never slows down to think, well, no, this was a little too far. We could never get the other side to believe this. And yet on our side, it's like, okay, not only are we convinced that we have common sense and reality on our side, but even more importantly than that, we literally believe that we have the living God on our side. And yet for some reason, it's like, oh no, but we could never convince the culture of conservative ideals. We could never have a revival of virtue. We could never. And I'm just honestly at a place where I'm like, dude, stop it with this loser mentality. Like, we need to stop. Right? Like, if the other side can convince the majority of the culture that men can become women, then guess what? We can convince the culture to pursue virtue. Right? We can do.
Amen.
There's actually a pretty good point, actually, by Javier.
So let's turn that into like a TikTok. That was great.
So, like, yeah, on defeatism, I think he has a good point on defeatism. If this is your attitude because you're a defeatist, I mean, you shouldn't you shouldn't be so defeatist. But on the point of whether or not the left is just convincing people that men can become women at like an individual level, and like they're winning the culture war through like popular level of persuasion. I don't think that's the case at all. I think the left shifts culture through having power in institutional structures, because they have power in nearly every elite institution in the U.S., from the government to the media to the schools to the corporations to everything. The NGOs, doesn't matter. The left seems to be at the top of the vast majority of all of that, and so they're able to push that from the top down. And I don't think they actually do. I don't think they actually do make popular level persuasions at the low level. I think they enforce it top down through institutional power.
Yeah, I would agree.
But this comes again to elite theory or not, which we talked about in last stream a little bit. But if you buy into elite theory, the idea that your government should not be kind of pushing for your side is you're pretty much going to consign yourself to lose. In the long term, if elite theory is true, then you do need institutions to be on your side, because otherwise you won't actually make any substantial difference. Maybe you could make a difference in one tiny pocket of some small city or something, but on the large scale, you simply won't go there on the premise that elite theory is true.
There's also an interesting puzzle here to think about, and I'm not pronouncing on it. I'm just raising it because I think the philosophically minded listeners might find it interesting. So let's suppose that the gospel and the sacraments have a actual effect on your behavior, per James. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that faith results in works. Well, then you have a problem for the government that's trying to decide where the left-hand kingdom begins and the right-hand one begins. You know what I'm saying? Because now all of a sudden, things like whether or not you have the Lord's Supper every week might actually have an effect on your civic behavior and the solidarity, unity, whatever else. If not, then you risk saying that these right-hand matters are trivial. But if there is that effect, then it becomes difficult to know. At least if you suppose that the government can coerce in matters of, let's say, left hand or horizontal, or however you want to characterize it, behavior.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting discussion. I
Do
feel
people
like
who go to church, are they better to work with? Maybe not. Maybe not. Well, then we have another problem.
yeah, I think that's an interesting discussion to have. Like, I would say that, to some extent, like, a lot of people in secular society might be motivated to do the external works that benefit society for like selfish reasons, or something like that. And so, but I feel like what the Christian doctrine and what James and the scriptures are getting at is like what it means for the Spirit to produce works in us is actually to do good works for the right reasons. To actually give us a motivation of like hope and love and faith in all of our actions. Because the secular world does feed the homeless and they do these things too, but for completely different reasons.
Yeah, I'll see you at the Secular Humanist Hospital. We can go. I know what you mean, though.
Yeah.
So Javier says, but the left also didn't enforce everyone to believe that men can become women under the pain of corporeal punishment, at least not at first. Do you get what I mean? My response would be that it not directly necessarily, but try denying that in a workplace before any of that was enshrined in law. Like
He's saying initially.
Yeah.
Initially, yes. Yeah, not initially, no. But on that same front, though, I mean, I guess I can't speak for everyone on stream necessarily, but I would say that we should definitely try and take power of institutions too. In some ways, I think like Redeem Zoomers Reconquista is like a noble idea, at least, in that like retaking institutions is the way to influence society. Whether or not those particular institutions that he wants to retake are recoverable or not is a point of contention. But
there's also an assumption built in here that the left sort of took over institutions at a time when the government and the power of this role, so they sort of like played a fair game and won, right? So there's an assumption there that the government as it existed when they took over, when the left took over, whenever you think that was sort of just like, hands off rather than actively enabling it.
Yeah.
And that's something that should be proven because we've had a liberal, I mean that word intentionally, government on these things for quite some time.
Yeah, we have. So
the initial framing of that thought experiment has to be careful.
Yep.
Do it.
Yeah, that's right.
We just got to stop.
Yep.
It's this weird, like, well, we could never win the culture war. So actually what we need to do is, I guess not in a literal sense, but like wage war, right? We need like the sword to sort this out. And it's like, sorry, it drives me kind of crazy because I'm like, guys, really? Like, this is like the only thing we can resort to. We can't be more creative or resourceful than that and more dedicated to our ideals than this. Like, this is all we can do. So anyway, sorry.
Yeah. Well, and this is actually where, so Aristotle, I think, is also really helpful on this. We think that we need to enforce uniformity at the sort of political level. Aristotle was actually very much so, and Christian nationalists, this is actually one of my big critiques of Wolff's book, is that he sort of argues for a kind of principle of uniformity as a principle of cohesion. Aristotle decidedly argued against that, actually. So for him, one of the reasons revolutions might happen is because, well, maybe the poor outnumber the rich, or the rich outnumber the poor in power. And so he thought you needed a differentiated polis actually to keep the common life together so that one group doesn't trump another group. Now, what I'd want to say then, in light of that, is that, well, if that kind of government allows for differentiated institutions, there's nothing stopping us from actually, as Christians, creating institutions, like cultivating our institutions, doing other forms of political action, which actually don't seek top down to legislate uniformity. Again, Aristotle would have been opposed to that. But within the difference that sort of naturally subsists in a state or will subsist in a state because of the ambiguity of the saeculum, within that context, to advocate for institutions to publish, to write, to research, to put out materials that push back on the culture, that's a very possible thing. And I think we've actually, like, the rise of someone like, even though Jordan Peterson's not a Christian, right?
Sure.
Like, the rise of someone like him actually is evidence that you can actually reason with people towards a better side. Right, like he's doing this from a non-Christian, what I take to be anyway, a non-Christian perspective, like arguing for the supremacy of heterosexual marriage. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
he's arguing for the supremacy of sort of traditional family norms. He's not advocating for the state to enforce that. Well, so we have to think more creatively about what are the forms of political action that are non-coercive, that actually move then that actually accomplish the common good, and through non-coercive action seek to move people to experiencing the life of God.
Yeah, and
Yeah, for the sake of argument, why not both?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
we
so-
talked last stream about. Sorry, you can go, Tony.
Oh, no, I just want to say something about Javier's last point before it leaves my mind, because he was talking about defeatism as like, well, don't get the sword involved. Let's convince people first. Well, I agree with the spirit of that to some extent, right? Like, you should try to convince people without using the sword first. But an issue that our country was never able to resolve without government coercion, which I think Javier and Sean Luke would agree with, was ending slavery. They weren't able to convince the South to end slavery, so they literally used force to do it.
You're not wrong.
Sometimes for like extremely moral wrongs, I do think at times, I'm just saying this in general. So like, if you see like human trafficking was legalized for some reason, you're like, oh, well, we just gotta like talk to them about it. And it's like, after a certain point, you're gonna have to be like, all right, enough is enough. Like, we have to stop this, So I would say, like, I agree with where Javier and Sean are coming from, but I also feel like they would also agree, like, okay, at a certain point, like, we have to put a stop to this, so.
Right, which actually Jay Athanasius in chat put up earlier this very relevant point on that same point, or this very relevant comment on that same point, why the appeal to the marketplace of ideas. The marketplace of ideas is not a Christian supposition, and initially it even precluded certain ideas too contrary to the moral order. For example, Locke on atheists, who, Locke was against that, atheism. So yeah, I mean, like, this once again goes back to elite theory. Is the marketplace of ideas at a popular level even like a real thing? I think even the example of like Jordan Peterson is like, Jordan Peterson has massive audience. He's not just a random guy in the street trying to convince people, and he has a wider audience than anyone in our churches. He has one of the widest audiences just in general in the world, so he has power to influence these things. He was a former professor, and actually, is he still a professor? I don't know, maybe he is. I don't keep up with the details of his life, but he has a very large audience online, of course, through Daily Wire. So, that's an example of an elite influencing society. I don't think it's a true example of really, I think the idea of marketplace of ideas really falls apart under elite theory as a critique. There's an amount of ideas being transferred, but it's from elites to the populace, generally speaking. And so you have to convince elites to kind of, be in your direction, which generally entails you yourself being an elite of some sort. Anybody else have comments on that, or should we continue? Continue. Alrighty. Oh, actually, I had one more point. Last stream we talked about the adversarial role of the government. That the government is an advisor, which, to Cam's point, yeah, why not both? We can convince people, by propaganda pretty much first, and then if that doesn't work, go to coercion. I mean, that's great if the propaganda works first. Sometimes it does. That would be an example of the government being, part of its advisory role.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick disclaimer. I wasn't trying to like argue with like Javier at all. I was just saying, like, I feel like hopefully they could appreciate, like, sometimes like the state has to be like, okay, enough's enough, and stop a huge problem, basically.
Yeah, Javier just made another point.
Yeah, Javier says, I think we should make our own institutions and have our own elites who influence society. That's different from having the government coercing people, though. I agree, they're different.
I think it would only coerce people at the level of those people actually doing things that would be, considered immoral, right? It wouldn't be coercing people on the same precise level of, the promulgation of ideas, right? Like, that's kind of, I think the point that we're making is that you can do both, right? That's the thing. You can try to convince people by taking over institutions, And, to the degree to which you have power, you can enforce, your ideas. But you should also still try to convince people at the same time, right? Because ultimately speaking, you're not just the magistrate for the people who support you, right? You're the magistrate for the people who don't support you. And you want to convince those people. And so I think both are important, because you can have political power without having control of the institutions. I mean, that's actually kind of what we're about to see in 2025, right? Where, the right does not have the institutions. It's actually losing an increasing amount of grasp over even the church, right? But, it does have political control. And the right's job, I think, is actually going to be convincing people, not even so much through coercion, although in theory it would be fine if they did. Not necessarily on every single, level possible, but in theory, yes, it would be in principle okay to say that, we're not going to allow a certain group to be married, that we think, the Bible precludes from being married, gays, for instance. And at the same time, we're going to try to convince people, via these Jordan Peterson-esque arguments that, heterosexual marriage is the way to go. And I think both are possible. That's kind of the issue I have with this approach, is that I don't I think we should be more inventive, and I would agree with him on that. But I don't think that precludes the government actually taking, matters into its own hands at points.
Well, yeah. So on the abortion issue in particular, I actually have some friends who are pro-choice people, and they have claimed the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the states cracking down on some of the states cracking down on it is violating their rights. They're coercing against their inherent right to procure an abortion or something, and because they think they're infringing on their bodily autonomy rights. Now, the thing is at some level, once a law is put into place, there's always going to be at least some level of coercion, because you're always going to have at least some people that are just going to want to disobey the new law, right? And I don't think Javier and Sean actually think anti-abortion laws are inherently bad. But some people in your state are going to think that they have a right to it, okay? That's just, unfortunately, the world we live in. And so we are going to be infringing upon, what people, delusional rights that people think they have, right? So that, but the Christian magistrate ultimately has to have the one that is going to have to make the stand that I have the correct actual rights in mind, and you have the delusional rights, and I have to coerce you now. So,
Right.
Yes, and I will say to Javier's next point here, about the pro-choice argument. I would agree with you that I do agree abortion violates the non-aggression principle, because it does. But I think in the meantime, you can still ban it even if most people are unconvinced, right? That's my take, is that you should try to convince them in the meantime. But even on libertarian grounds, it actually is the case that, relevant civil governments, which is, not state related, but, it's an institution that, punishes rights violations. Libertarians would actually say, at least a lot of them, that even if most people are against you, you actually have the right in those situations to do the right thing, right? So if the majority actually tells you, hey, we want to kill, innocent people, right? The magistrate actually has the right to say, no, we're not going to do that, right? And, it's similar to this. I think in the meantime, you can say that, no, we're not going to allow that to happen, but you should also try to convince people. And so I think both, ironically enough, to use Sean's example, right? I think both of the roles of the magistrate are at play here, right? He has a role in advising people, as Seth said also. And he also has a role in, coercing people from doing the wrong thing in the meantime. I think both are important.
Yeah, I'll just say this real fast because I know we've got to get going. I don't think it's completely dead in the water because there are going to be people that actually disagree that it's infringing upon the right of the baby. Or there's going to be people that make arguments against rights absolutism, and they think certain right violations are justified in certain scenarios. You have the famous philosophical paper, the violinist argument, for example. There's just a lot of people that just don't agree that the fetus actually even has rights. So that kind of is a non-starter.
People also disagree about whether a baby has a right to be baptized. So there's all kinds of disagreements.
Yeah. So at some point, somebody's got to make the decision okay, I think babies clearly have a right, and all your arguments against this are bad. But ultimately, you're going to coerce them to have to act in accordance with the leader of the state's values, or at least the majority of the people in that state's values. So I don't think it's a dead in the water argument, because people literally disagree about the fundamentals of whether or not fetuses even have rights at all. So
on the note of institutions and trying to convince people, and obviously we should try to do that, but Noah made the point earlier, and I think it's worth repeating, that we have had a, generally speaking, liberal government for quite a long time. And it's not when the institutions were, the long march to the institutions, as it's called, it's not like that took place while the government was just sitting there opposing it or something, and the left was just super geniuses who managed to take over everything. The government kind of sat back and watched or assisted it along the way, depending on the particular people in power at any given time and in any given location. So,
there was a time when all the Ivies, right, they started out very different from how they are now, and somebody changed the laws, changed the policies, put people in place, voted for someone to be in charge of those universities who was not from whatever group started them, and maybe the government's hands were completely clean in all of that. That's always a theoretical possibility. I haven't studied it enough to say for sure.
I've studied some of this, and I can't say it seems completely clean.
Yeah, especially once you bring immigration into the picture.
Yes, that too.
Yeah. Which Javier's next point, I think, put it on screen, but play the.
We'll play. Yeah, it's just clarification.
And again, so right now, I guess I'm going to date this video. It won't be evergreen anymore, but we're in November of 2024. Right, and Donald Trump just won the election, regardless of any misgivings that I think both of us would have with Donald Trump. The truth is, the conservatives in this country just won a massive victory, a victory that the other side was not expecting. And this is something that I think, because people live inside of bubbles, and we don't pay attention to the other side, and of course our own side, when we're doing badly, is castigating us, right? Our pundits and all these things. But I don't know if people are paying attention, but the left and the people of the other side, but from different corners of the left, right, including their major sort of online voices, whether that's Destiny, or whether that's Vosh, or whether that's Hassan Piker, or so on and so forth. Right now, they're incredible. I was watching, I think it was Vosh the other day, he's like a socialist, sort of postmodern figure, and he was arguing to his own side. Guys, the conservatives have completely dominated and overtaken the podcasting sphere. The conservatives, this is so bad. How did we allow this to happen? Right. But if you listen to our side, it would just be no, but this is impossible. How could we ever convince people? So, you're like, dude, maybe listen to the other side. We just had a massive victory, and they're convinced that they've fallen behind on this area. And meanwhile, we're no, but what we really need is the sword. And it's hey, maybe the message that we have, again, to reiterate what I said before, right? Not only is commonsensical, but also maybe there's something beautiful to it, and there's something to all these things that we're talking about that people want to believe in, and maybe they don't necessarily need to just be coerced into believing these things, right? And I think we need to believe in our own values, and especially in Christianity, our faith. We need to believe in it much more. Before I ask you the next question here.
Do we want to continue through this whole section, or do we want to skip to the next one?
We can skip. I just want to say one quick thing to Javier's recent comment. Sure. I just want to ask Sean and Javier if they ever want to respond to this. Do you think that the state can, outlaw things like, driving under the influence. That's not an inherent rights violation. Perjury, adultery, defamation, selling goods that aren't owned by, selling goods that you just bought from another company. That's not stealing, but it's drug use, selling drugs. Let's see what else.
Corn,
etc.
Giving drugs to
corn.
Children. Giving drugs to children.
They are talking about spiritual matters here. The question is how you draw that line, right?
Well, Sean's framing in the first half seemed to be a negative rights type of situation where
I see.
the government shouldn't coerce outside of that.
I didn't watch the whole first half, so that my bad.
Yeah, so I think because Javier's last comment was like, well, the government can never use. We're not saying the government can never use coercion. Only like the government can obviously coerce to prevent like murders. But I also want to ask, like, would Javier and Sean agree that the government can coerce against like driving under the influence or speeding or not using your turn signal? None of these are inherent rights violations. Not paying your bill on time. Can the government
not paying a bill on time could be stealing, which is and that would be a violation of property rights.
Well, I guess maybe not paying your taxes. That might not necessarily be a violation of any rights per se.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to continue through this section, or should we skip to the next one just for the sake of time?
Skip.
Okay. Yeah, because I feel like we talked this one a lot already.
So on to my next question here. You mentioned uniformity a little while ago, and Christian nationalists tend to argue for that. One of the ways that they do that, and this is a growing trend online, is to become fixated on matters of race or ethnicity, right? Yes. Concerning nation and nationalism, they will often advocate for a definition of nation and nationalism wherein only a single ethnicity with a common blood lineage has a life together consisting in shared language, history, memory, land, and mutual love. Could you evaluate the definition for us? And where does it fall short? And what would Christic liberalism advocate for in its place?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of the context, and Javier, I think you know who I'm talking about too. We have friends who would say, we're both less American for being colored. And the assumption there is that the color of your skin, and this is a true biological fact at least, indicates a kind of rootedness in place for a while, right? So that's the reason why skin tone sort of evolves through a series of microevolutionary changes through being situated in a place for at least a few generations. And so it indicates having been rooted in a different place. That's at least the claim. And they'll often point to people like Aristotle in book 5, and this is where I think they actually start to butcher the sources. In book 5, they'll point to when Aristotle's talking about revolution, and he's like, well, one cause of revolution and state failure is like letting in a bunch of people from a different race. But Aristotle's reasoning for that is that, and think about his context, right? In the ancient world, travel is a lot more restricted than it was in our day and age, than it is in our day and age. The flow of ideas is obviously a lot more restricted as well. And so his assumption is that if a state just lets in a bunch of foreigners, that those foreigners are still likely assimilated to where they came from. And therefore, they're unlikely to uphold the ideals expressed in the constitution of a state. So if that's his reasoning, then doesn't actually, it has very little to do actually with, well, people are naturally bonded to people who look like them. That's not what he's arguing. He's arguing on ideological grounds that, well, they're a lot less likely to be ideologically assimilated to the place that they're in. But again, importantly for Aristotle, as we just quoted in book 3, he disagrees with the idea that the continuity of race constitutes the continuity of a state. He thinks it's the continuity of constitution. So Christic liberalism then would look at the current state of things and say, look, I understand where Aristotle was coming from. We also live in a very different era where the flow of ideas are a lot faster, where language, the ability to travel is a lot more unrestricted as well. So what you can have now that you couldn't necessarily have then is in one generation, I sound very different than my parents. Just being raised here. Because of the sort of connectedness of America, because of growing up in the schools here and things like this, I sound different. I think different to them. I remember when I met some of my relatives from India, they're like, "Oh, he's American-born, confused Desi. He's just basically like an American." And so for them, I didn't feel it very Indian actually. Now that's a modern reality that's brought about by globalization and technology. So that changes. If the rationale for Aristotle was, well, the letting in other races, or the mass letting in of other races, though again, he thought they could be incorporated as citizens and that would still be a legitimate state. So like even on that ground, like Knister's just still misreading him. But like on his own terms, the reasons he was hesitant about that don't apply anymore because of technology today and globalization today. Because assimilating to the ideals of a constitution, which I agree, that citizens of a state should actually try to, they shouldn't seek to overturn the constitution of the state that they're citizens of. I'd say that's true. But you can learn those ideals a lot faster than you ever could before. And so his reasons for restricting that doesn't apply anymore. So
I think just in the, well, first, I think to critique his definition at the beginning, he shifted the definition from nation to state there, which we talked about in the last stream. That when Aristotle is talking about the continuation of a state, he talks about the continuation of the constitution, not the continuation of the bloodline. And I don't think I shouldn't say any, but I don't think most Christian nationalists would disagree with that. The issue is that nations and states are not the same thing, in that the continuation of a nation does depend on bloodline. That seems to be just the general idea of what nations are in the ancient world, which we talked about a little bit last time. For example, I point out Herodotus in the histories uses the definition for nation that included blood, also included language and religion and customs. So that's just like the definition of how nations continue. That's what a nation is, but that is not the same as what a state is. So you have to distinguish between nation and a state, and that seems to be confused here again, where he says, well, look, Aristotle says the continuation of a state is about the constitution, not the people group inside of it. Well, sure. I mean, that's fine. We can have the continuation of a nation without the people group staying the same. That's what happened in the United States, for example, where the United States is this big federal government over a bunch of smaller states, and the people groups inside the states have changed, and the United States government, or the United States, has still continued as a state. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the United States has not changed as a nation. And I don't just mean like as a culture or something like that. I mean like the people group inside of it has actually changed over time. And so it arguably has shifted shifted from one nation to another, or from one nation to multiple nations, or from multiple nations to a different number of multiple nations, possibly, depending on how you want to look at that question. What was I going to say? No. Oh yeah. But just in the abstract, I think that's kind of a critique here. I think there's something to be said on the question of assimilation and debates about how well that actually goes between different groups. That's a bit dicey to talk about on stream, perhaps, though. I don't know. Anybody else have thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, like I'm sort of like uncertain on where I fall in that whole discussion. So I'm just sort of like a normie bystander on that topic. But I don't really have much to add other than I can kind of see where you and both of them are coming from, I guess. I withhold any judgments.
I can speak at least a little bit to Aristotle, and I think it's a helpful conversation to have, what increased globalization means, because depending on how you sort out your background assumptions, you might argue, as these guys are, that it's now easier to assimilate. But if you tweak the background assumptions differently, you actually can settle on the view that it's harder now to assimilate, because people can come from now vastly different places than they did before. So, you can come to Minnesota from Somalia in like under 24 hours now. So some could argue that would actually make assimilation harder than if you go from, Athens to like Sparta or someplace like that. So Aristotle is operating in a Greek world where, all Greeks do, at least mythologically, they think of themselves as having the same bloodline, the same sort of parentage. And even with that level of homogeneity, you still saw plenty of empires and cities overthrown by, foreigners coming in and growing until they, and I know Sean's aware of that because he mentions it in one of his videos, that cities can be overthrown by foreigners starting to outnumber the natives. I just don't know if the reason for that is, they didn't have like Duolingo so that they could learn the dialect quicker. I just don't. I'm just not convinced that that's the case. As far as Aristotle goes on this concept, he does talk in the Politics a little bit about race, although race wouldn't be the correct term as we use it today, because everyone he talks about is, when Aristotle talks about Asians, he doesn't mean people in Japan. Nevertheless, he does talk about different types of people, Europeans, Asians, and he says that these people have sort of natural constitutions which are not simply a function of the laws that they live under, because Aristotle's explicit that you got to look at people's natural constitutions so that the legislator can know how to legislate. So this is something, which the legislator, he says explicitly, Aristotle, this is book 7, it's clear that the sort of people which a legislator can easily guide into the way of goodness is one with a natural endowment that combines intelligence and spirit. So according to Aristotle, Europeans, they live in cold climates, so they have lots of spirit, but no skill or intelligence. And then the people in Asia have lots of skill and intelligence, but they have no spirit. So they're all just slaves all the time because they've got no spirit. And wouldn't you know, the Greeks are the golden mean because they've got just the right amount of intelligence, just the right amount of spirit, and they live in the temperate climate, not too hot, not too cold. Okay, so it's a little bit of Greek propaganda. But the point being, Aristotle does think that there are these sort of natural qualities that emerge in people which make them suitable more or less to greater or lesser degrees for certain types of laws. So I don't think that Aristotle's a magic soil guy. I really don't.
So
yeah, and to that point, Johann Gottfried von Herder, who is a Lutheran pastor in the 1700s, he is a pietist, but he is nonetheless a German Lutheran pastor. He discusses in his outlines of a philosophy of the history of man the different people groups of the world, and he does not make any distinctions between the natural inclinations of people groups and their physical features, really. So he kind of lumps these together. The character of a people group, he just kind of discusses it all together as one thing. So he'll talk about how certain groups behave, and the next sentence talk about their facial structure. And this is just how he's going about discussing the topic. And this is just a 1700s Lutheran going about how he's going to discuss philosophy of people. He just, that's how he frames it. I don't think that's out of line with Aristotle here. Like Noah said, actually, he agrees with Aristotle. He also says Greeks are the best, surprisingly, despite being a German himself. He doesn't use the word best necessarily, but the way he goes about describing the groups, he seems to say that Greeks are the best people group in the world. So I guess there's some agreement with there. Maybe he read Aristotle.
So I guess like one thing that may have created like a disconnect between like Sean and the person he interacted with too is that like I don't think Sean really understood like a distinction between like a citizen and like what it means to be a member of a nation. And so like at least that's kind of what I gathered from the last episode I guess we interacted to, or the first half of the stream. So like he probably interpreted that as like, oh, he thinks this person thinks I'm less of a citizen or something. But like what that person probably meant was something where like, well, you're not really, like how that person understood the term nation was just different than the way that Sean understood it. He probably thought that nation and citizen were like sort of just semantic, like tomato kind of. And so like to Sean's point, like if he's using the term American to refer to citizenship, then yeah, like I would actually say Sean and Javier are actually just Americans if it's corresponding to like what citizenship means. And so that may have been where the disconnect was too, because I think Sean has like a different definition of what a nation is basically than like like you pointed out, Seth, like the older definitions of what a nation is what I would guess. Now, like my, I don't, I'm not personally set on what I think the definition of a nation is, but there's all sorts of different definitions out there. But you are correct, Seth, that the ancient definition. You are correct to point out what the ancient definition is, basically. But yeah.
Now, what I'd also want to say is that with immigration, it's true that you do have a lot of differing visions of the good life that come in with immigration, with people, with allowing foreigners in. But the unique thing about America is that it was actually very much designed philosophically as a liberal state. My camera keeps falling down there. It was designed as a liberal state that was very intentional, such that people of differing particular visions of the good life could still be committed to each other with respect to political freedom and friendship on that level. Like, there's nothing stopping me. I've done this before, like having meals with my atheist friends, or like coffee with them or whatever. Like, nothing's stopping me from doing that. So for Aristotle, again, he emphasizes the importance of common meals in facilitating the unity of a polis. There's actually nothing stopping us from doing that now, given the commitment to political freedom. So Christic Liberalism actually looks at Aristotle and says, look, like, there's actually a lot there to agree with in terms of citizens of a state needing to be committed to the Constitution and to the ideals of the Constitution that are writ into the form of government. Like, you can't come into a state and then say, okay, I'm going to overthrow the state. Like, you're not a good citizen if you do that. You're probably not a legitimate citizen if that's your goal. But that actually doesn't describe a lot of us who are second generation, first generation immigrants. A lot of our parents, it doesn't describe.
Which, by the way, I honestly feel like, not for everybody, but for quite a few people, it may genuinely just be, and this is why I always give, I always try to always give the benefit of the doubt. I think the average person maybe either doesn't have this, or maybe they don't realize that they do, have friends that are second generation immigrants, to where I think the average person sometimes gets sold on this idea of like, no, these people are completely like the other, and they're this unknown factor, and it's almost like a nefarious agent in our nation. And this might sound reductive, all right, but a genuine question that I have is normally like, do you have friends from this group that you're criticizing? Not because of any, I guess I don't know, like woke representation quota type of thing, but it's just a genuine like, well, do you know these people, right? Because like the average second generation immigrant that I know, I mean, well, I guess I'm not technically one. I wasn't born here. I came when I was 9 years old. I've been here longer than it was ever in Venezuela.
So you're like 1.5.
Yeah, 1.5 gen. But it's like, to your point, right? What we hear from all our relatives is, oh, you guys think completely differently, right? You're American, right?
Yep.
It's so funny. I mean, now to be fair, a lot of this will vary, right, from group to group. I do actually think in more left-leaning groups, you might not have what I'm about to describe in a second, but at least in more conservative groups, what you do have even is like, if someone is being extra, let's say, right, wanting to, I don't know, something that happens all the time, I guess, like someone's trying to flex that they speak like another language, right? Or they want to pronounce the words, and they will get roasted, and it'll be like, no, dude, like, come on, you're being kind of extra, right? You're being kind of stupid. Like, and even the reason I mentioned that, right, is there is a focus on integrating, right? And it's not some forced integration. It's like, no, you were raised here, or you want to be here. You love this country. And for better or for worse, to your point earlier about technology, we have, right, all of us, this computer in our pockets that we're glued to all the time. Our eyes are on the screen all the time. And we're getting the same sort of cultural references, memes, all of these things beamed into our heads, for better or for worse, essentially. And we have all these same cultural touch points. But then the other side tends to argue that, well, you know what? This gets almost like caricature, to where you'll hear the other side be like, oh, this magic soil doctrine, where someone sets foot in your soil and suddenly they're just like every other citizen that was born here and has a legacy here. And it's like, no, we're not literally saying like fresh off the boat or whatever, right, or fresh off the plane, you're the same as everybody. But I guess what we are arguing is, but with enough time spent here, and presumably if you came here, you want to be here, right? There's always cases that are the odd one out, but presumably like you want to be here, right? You want to integrate. Your children will just grow up here speaking the language, thinking the way that their peers think and speak, and if you're not ostracized, but you're instead embraced by the people, you're taught, right, the cultural norms of the country. You're taught to celebrate the holidays of the nation. You're told to value the history of this nation, and you're told, instead of being told, hey, actually, you'll never be quite like me, you're told, hey, actually, you can love this country just as much as I do. I love this nation. You should be a part of it. You should want to know the history. You should want to know the culture. You should want to celebrate. The average person will integrate. And they want to be a part of this group. They want to be a part of this nation. And I think, not to be cliche, right, but I do think there's this sort of fear of the other. And that's not to say, this like this unique.
Yeah, not as the left. The left abuses useful terms.
All right, someone puts in chat, Jeremiah Greshamson, I believe that's how it's pronounced. He says, American liberalism in the 1700s was submissive to a lot of things. It's silly to conflate it with Karl Popper's The Open Society liberalism. I think this is a point worth making here. And I'm going to make this is a little bit of a jab and an opportunistic one. But I'm going to say that I do love this country, and I love this country such that I think the states were right at the beginning when they had state churches. And that it doesn't seem like any of the groups that have come here since then really think that's a great idea. So it just to the point of does population changing shift the nation, or rather does it shift the state? Does it shift the nation? Does it shift both? Does it shift the culture of this particular region? I think it absolutely does over time. And perhaps I'm making an opportunistic jab, but I think I will make it to make a point here that that is an actual thing that has shifted, and perhaps in part at least, that could be to some degree due to shifts in the group that already existed, but it can also be due to shifts in the population. I do think it's worth noting that the U.S. Had very particular policies on immigration when it came to not only religion, but also which nations people came from. For most of its history, it was actually fairly strict on those issues. And the idea of America as like a melting pot is a fairly recent idea. I believe I'm trying to remember I read recently where the term melting pot was actually coined for this discussion, and it was not too long ago. It is definitely after the Civil War. I'm not remembering the exact year now, if it was late 1800s or early 1900s. I want to say it was early 1900s. But the idea really didn't get popularized until much later, certainly, and especially going into the 1960s, especially with the 65 Immigration Act. But there are, I guess, yeah, I'm not going to dwell on that too much longer.
Yeah, I wanted to reply very briefly to Javier's point on the sufficient conditions for a nation. Only to say that I think that Wolf's book had a very narrow set of aims. So, like, a lot of people dunk on Wolf's book for him basically saying at the get-go, like, I'm not going to actually make an exegetical case for, like, Christian nationalism. Like, he says that because he has a very narrow set of aims. And so him, like, not providing a strict definition or a adequate definition of the nation is not that surprising, because he's trying to essentially engage in this like nationalist, project that had been actually debated, I would say, fairly, with a fair degree, like a degree of frequency, for like a minute, like as an example, like Yoram Hazani, who's a Israeli, American philosopher. Like, he wrote a book on, nationalism, which was very influential before that. And so, like, as long as you think that nationalism as such is something that is in principle definable, right? The point he's making, I think, holds. You might say that, well, I disagree with tying, nationalism to a particular ethnic group or something. Fair enough. I actually think that you can maybe, in theory, engage within, Wolf's project, or engage with Wolf's project, and disagree with maybe his particular theory about how the nation works. I think that that's kind of the point of it, is that it actually is, it's sort of inviting you to have these conversations. And I think that's a good thing, actually, in a very real sense, that you can have someone like, Doug Wilson, who I would say is probably less rigorous on this, having a different definition of a nation, right? And I think these conversations probably should be had with that in mind, that, it actually is true that, people can have different conceptions of what the nation is, and how we should, treat that definition in terms of our public policy.
Into oblivion. Yeah, it's a genuine xenophobia, like actual xenophobia. Yeah.
Well, and again, it's like it's not fear of the other, like, like the left would say, like, oh, only white people can do this. No. Everybody does this.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
Right.
if something is unknown to you, you hate everything about it. You freak out. You don't want to be near it. And this is what we all do. And so I guess I guess part of my thought process here for people is like, if people have friends right outside of the crazy leftist circles, but like no, in your average everyday life, the average immigrant and the average person that's here doesn't hate the country and want to undermine it. The average person loves this country, and the reason they came here is because they're like, at least where we live, right in the U.S., it's like, man, this is the greatest country in the world, baby. That's why that's why we're here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Considering that we have a substantial population in some of the southern states that actively vote in Mexican elections and fairly openly engage in in just blatant government interference between Mexico and the U.S. I am not sure this is the case for all immigrants. I'm using a particular example there. The situation I have in mind is discussed by Buchanan in Death of the West. It's somewhere in the first half. I'm not remembering the chapter anymore. I'm sorry, but you can go and read about that discussion of that situation. So in Death of the West was written in 2001. So this is not like a recent new development that happened in the past 10 years or something like that. This has been going on for at least 25 years or so, if not substantially longer. In fact, I forget the exact situations that Buchanan describes, but it might have been a few years before the book was even written, the exact things he's discussing. So we're talking perhaps 30 plus years that particular type of thing is going on. So I just disagree empirically on that point that all immigrants come here thinking that the U.S. is great and just want to become U.S. I do live in Detroit. We do have Mexican Town here, and Mexican Town does not seem to want to become the U.S. at all, frankly. In fact, it seems to increasingly expand and make more areas like Mexican Town, which I enjoy Mexican Town, but it's not the U.S. It is Mexican Town. It feels like Mexico. And Mexico can be Mexico and Mexico, but it doesn't seem to me like they're really trying to become like the U.S. or really want to become like the U.S. The signs are all in Spanish. Like Mexican music plays everywhere, and the culture in general, like the way people handle themselves, is not very American in that territory. I'm just talking about like mannerisms and things like that, and just the things people prioritize. Does not seem, very American. And I'm up in Michigan. This is not really close to Mexico.
Another element.
As someone who does live close to Mexico, I can attest all these things are true.
So it's close to Mexico and far away. And this is not an insubstantial portion of the population in Detroit. Detroit is the largest city in Michigan. It has the most cultural power in the state, and a huge portion of it is a growing portion, has a growing Mexican population in it that does not seem to want to integrate. And it because that's a cultural power in the state of Michigan, that is going to have an impact on the entire state. And the same goes for Dearborn. Everybody knows, I guess not everybody, but a lot of people know Dearborn's the largest Arab population outside of the Middle East. And in Dearborn, it just increasingly expands, and multiple generations down, people are still not speaking English. In fact, they are still speaking Arabic. And not only that, but they are trying to expand the use of Arabic in the area to the point that lots of signs aren't even in English anymore. They're only in Arabic. That's how it is there. They don't seem to really want to become American. So I actually question this premise quite strongly that, even the majority of immigrants who want to come here necessarily want to just become Americans. And I think a lot of them bring in their own culture and, system here. They bring their nation here, which is, so I'm sure a lot of them do want to integrate, but some of them simply don't. And as a substantial enough portion that it's like a legitimate change in the entire area. Everybody in Metro Detroit knows that the Arab Muslim population in Dearborn has expanded not only in Dearborn, but outside of Dearborn, to where there's an entire pocket of Metro Detroit now that is Arab speaking and has signs in Arabic and is Muslim culture. and
Yeah.
it influences the homeowners organizations, it influences the schools. The schools are all trying to be Muslim and enforce Sharia law. I mean, this is not a small thing.
I'll say one word to bolster your point, Seth. Britain.
Yeah. Britain, I think, is a good example, and like the thing that I think you touched on there at the end, Seth, that I think was particularly good is that you don't actually even have to say, like, deny, Javier's point that the majority of immigrants are this way. Let's say that 60% of them are this way, right? It still means that 40% of them aren't, and so that means that you should be skeptical of this whole arrangement, because we're not dealing with periodic immigration at this point. We're dealing with mass migration. And that's the issue, right? Is that if you're importing 40% of people who dislike the country, and that's not even dealing with, the illegal immigrants who I would say have like no incentive to accommodate themselves to the broader culture, to assimilate to the broader culture, beyond, I would say, social, life and things like that. Then yes, I think at that point you should be skeptical of the entire arrangement, and I would say, empirically speaking, as someone who, as I said, lives very close to Mexico, as someone who I can attest, and yes, some of this I think is probably illegal immigration, but I think a lot of it is also just mass migration in general. It does change the makeup of town. So I grew up in South Texas as an example. When my parents moved there, it was just a standard, southern, town, where I grew up. By the time I graduated graduated high school, it was not that. It was a very different sort of place. I remember one of my neighbors, actually, was literally had like a Mexican flag on their front lawn, and stuff like that. Like, in a sense, I guess you can say that's being, that's them being proud of their culture, and there is something to be said for that. But there is a real sense in which, that's not good, and yes, I do agree with you, Javier, that I think it probably will turn into your anecdotes versus our anecdotes. But I do think that the problem is that if we were dealing with like periodic immigration, then yes, maybe you kind of just bite the bullet and just be like, oh yeah, there's going to be a certain amount that kind of dislike us, so what, right? But no, we're importing tons of these people, and some of them are just coming across the border. I mean, yes, that is something that you need to ponder, I think, rather significantly.
Yeah, oh, sorry, do you want to say something? Yeah, just as an anecdote too, like, funny enough, in my area, just like Seth and Cameron, I actually have a decent large Hispanic population in my area as well. Which is odd for my state, but I do, just in my area, oddly enough. And through my job, which I won't disclose, I work with a large amount of them. Like, they're my biggest, people I work with. But anecdotally, I've met the people that Javier's talking about. I've met some of them for sure. Like, they're very much wanting to be American and get enlarged with the culture, and they learn the language. One of a lot of them vote for Trump and all this stuff. But then there's a large amount, which, funny enough, a lot of them are actually illegals. They don't want to learn English at all. They expect you to learn their language. They don't know anything about American culture, and they don't seem like they have any desire to learn it. So, to Seth and Cameron's point, so I've seen both. I would say it's kind of like, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but it's probably like 50-50 in my anecdotal experience, honestly. So.
Yeah, and you might point out that, well, the Germans were actually kind of slow to integrate in this way. I would say the difference here is that the Germans tended to move to areas that were not very dense in their population, and they weren't taking over areas so much as they were moving to places and kind of homesteading there, right? Yeah, and yes, they were slow to assimilate, but they eventually did, and they did so in a way that it made sense because they broadly held to a Protestant, Christian, set of, moral principles, right? And, I would say that, we can maybe have this question if we were actually selecting for that sort of thing. But, I actually think that would make our immigration system a lot harder. That's the thing. You would actually have to do like a lot of very rigorous tests on people, right? In terms of like what they believe and things like that. And so in theory, yes, I think you could do that. But, like the question is whether that's actually any better than the current system, or if it's certainly less efficient, and it actually would just kind of involve mass migration ending regardless.
Well, and German culture isn't Mexican culture, and even if people assimilate, there's, if you come over in sufficient quantities, you're going to, bring some of that for however long. And if you live in a big enough group in, say, New York City or Dallas or Dearborn or wherever, that could go on indefinitely. I did want to push back a little bit on this. Everyone who comes here, they just love America and they just want to be American. I'm sure that's true, but their conception of what American is such that they don't all love America the same. In fact, I'll use myself as an example. My family has been here longer than a first generation immigrant, but we came here a little before 1900. So, there are boat trailers with my great grandfather's names on them because they manufactured boat trailers, but there are no like metropolitan libraries. So I love the country as where I was born, where I came from, but in a very real sense, it is not my country to the extent that someone who can trace his ancestry to Jamestown and who can say that he's related to, people who came right from the start. So there are degrees to this. And at the far left end of the spectrum, let's say, are people who say, why do you want to be American? Well, because there's nice things there and I want nice things. I heard that over there you can get health insurance. That's no conception. That's not patriotism. That's greed. That's breaking perhaps breaking the 9th or 10th commandment. And, and that's most people. Most people are mostly concerned with, how do I feed my family? How do I get health care? Right. And these are legitimate concerns, but they're not substitutes for patriotism or with identifying with a nation. That's just not the case. And that doesn't mean those desires are bad, but let's not conflate that with feeling, a deep sense of familial pride or filial piety towards a nation.
I'd like to also just as a personal example. So I'm part Lebanese, for example, which Lebanese is not in Europe as people would know. And just as an example of something where there are holdovers pretty much no matter what. Well, first of all, my uncles both speak Arabic, but past that, I make Lebanese food at home. Is that very assimilating into American culture? Not in particular, no. That is not a particularly American thing to make baba ganoush at home. Most Americans don't do that. And I will wear my University of Michigan Lebanese Club shirt around for those who leave Lebanon, but for whom Lebanon never leaves is what the back of the shirt says, which also does not sound too much like assimilation. And yet I wear that shirt around because I have I have filial pride, right, for my people. So just as an example of literally myself, did my family perfectly integrate? Did I perfectly integrate into the U.S.? And the answer is simply no, because I still have this filial tie to Lebanon, despite being generations removed. And my Lebanese family came over here in the how many generations ago now? 3-4 generations ago now. So these are long ties that the roots do not just go away magically.
And anyway, people don't seem to appreciate that as much.
Well, and this is why one of the brilliant things about, I think, the founding fathers of America, like in the way they thought about citizenship, right? Like the test for citizenship, what my mom had to do to acquire citizenship, like that test, it's actually pretty extensive, you know? Like a lot of ways, she actually ended up having to have, and a lot of people who acquire citizens who are naturalized end up having to have like a better knowledge of American history than a lot of like natural born citizens.
Yep.
And there's a reason for that, namely so that they can remain committed to minimally the ideals that cohere us as a polis, right? Which in America, that is largely the commitment to political freedom. We are in a lot of ways like one of the first genuinely like classically liberal states. I actually think we might be the first, which is part of what makes us, you know, unique. But the framers intentionally wanted citizens, people who wanted citizenship, to know American history so that you could be committed to the ideals that are expressed in the Constitution, which are, of course, then the written Constitution is a reflection of the way we've organized ourselves, which is kind of what Aristotle's talking about. But then you sort of track that with Aristotle, like, and well, if a citizen is committed to the way the government has organized itself and the ideals expressed in that organization, well, then there's actually no reason why they're not actually genuine citizens or that they should fall under any suspicion. And this, again, is another place where Christian nationalists and Kinnists alike are just misreading Aristotle. He doesn't think that, again, uniformity of look or blood are important for their own sake. He thinks that they come into play when when people who are from a different group are actually like opposed to the Constitution or whatever. But that doesn't have to be the case. And of course, in America, it just often isn't.
And on the shared blood point, I feel like sometimes, the argument we made about like, no, but your lineage and your roots and all this stuff. I think sometimes it gets very
useless Aristotle, but that's just not what he.
I think sometimes it gets very speculative to be charitable there.
Do we want to continue this whole section, or do you want to skip it? We discussed it enough.
I didn't watch this ahead of time, but some of the things that I said, I feel like they're bringing up now. But
they actually kind of did come back around to it. Actually, it's funny that you mentioned speculative, and then I just gave, literally me. Literally me. I did not assimilate in 4 generations, so
we're coming up on 2 hours as well.
I just wanted to reply to Dominic's message here really quick and to say that, I would agree it's not necessarily wrong. And I think there's a way to indicate that, right? That, it is not a, indication of like dual loyalty or something, to use a term that I shouldn't right now. Like it's not necessarily one of those. So like, Texas flies, the state and the, national flag, together. Like, again, there are contexts in which you can explain it away, but in general, the flag as such does indicate that, this is the country that has sovereignty over this particular land and to which I owe a certain amount of loyalty. Like, yes, you can explain it away, but like the bare, like putting up of that flag is always going to indicate something as such prima facie. And that's the issue, right? Like, yes, there are ways to, I think, evade the force of the argument, but, you actually have to honestly shift the entire culture in order for that to actually, for this argument to work, because when people are seeing this flag flying, they are going to think a certain, amount of like assumptions, and rightfully so, because that's what flags are intended to do in most circumstances.
Do we want to? I agree. Did we want to skip to the next section then? Or so there are a few sections. We are pretty long here.
I think we should. I think we should probably skip ahead a little bit because I feel like we've said most of what we wanted to on this topic.
So there's consensus of antiquity. Liberalism bad because Enlightenment bad. I kind of want to do that section. It's really short too. False freedom. True
yes
freedom.
And yes. Like
I feel like the false freedom versus true freedom and the Old Testament section might be interesting.
Did we want to skip consensus of antiquity or watch it?
Probably skip it.
Does anyone have like a large sum of information on a large empirical set of data for the consensus of antiquity on stream right now? Like just at hand?
On what subject? On coercion?
Oh, I don't know. I guess it's probably the whole thing. Probably just nationalism in general.
Oh, well, I mean, one of the interesting... Well, no, let's just skip it.
Okay. To liberalism bad because Enlightenment bad then? It's a short section. I think it'd be interesting.
Liberalism is people hate on liberalism, but the classical liberals were not all so bad. I don't know what I haven't talked to you guys too much
under the
about
typical
it, but-
definition of what classical liberals were like back then.
Yeah,
I agree.
let's-
I don't think they were that bad. I don't think that what classical liberals were back when that term was more coined are at all what classical liberals are today, though.
No, not at all.
It's definitely an equivocation on terms.
Well, there aren't classical liberals today. I just don't. I don't know who you would.
I don't think
consider.
anybody influential. I mean, I think maybe, you know, somewhere online, you know, you'll find the one or two random people, but like they actually are.
Yeah.
But we're talking like, you know, the same number of people who are, you know, like unironic, like Ingsoaks or something like that, right?
Yeah, we got asked that a little bit. I think there's a question in the last stream we got asked that on. Is like, do you think all the classical liberal figures are bad? And we were like, no, like they had some good ideas.
Like classical liberals were pro death penalty. They would punish, you know, obscenities. You know,
Yeah.
the immigration quotas.
If Burke
There was a
liberal,
good.
it's great.
What's that?
If Burke was a classical liberal, then you know, then they're not so bad.
Yeah,
they buddy up with reactionaries, actually, as it turns out.
Some of Ryan Turnipseed's YouTube and Twitter content is interesting on liberalism and neocons. Cool stuff. Anyway, we can keep going.
All right.
And another question too, since we're talking about history and you mentioned the Enlightenment, I thought maybe you could deal with this relatively quickly, but how would you address, because I can already see the comments, how would you address the, well, this time's out of the Enlightenment, and Enlightenment bad, so therefore this was bad, which we hear all the time. How would you address that?
It's just really shallow. Like, we've got to do better than that as Christians, you know? I think, and like, I get why people do this. Like, there have been a lot of public figures that haven't been helpful. Like N.T. Wright, for instance, like always saying, "Oh, this is a very modernist way of thinking." It's like, okay, well, okay, or like, yeah. So what I'd want to say is the modernist element there is the orientation towards freedom, which, by the way, is modernist only in the sense that it becomes predominant. Because again, as we've just discussed, Aristotle seems to argue against this, which means it was a view in his day. So it's not like out of nowhere either. There were people who thought like this. It just becomes more predominant, like it comes to rise in the Enlightenment. So that's the first thing. I think, like, obviously, like, to say it's modernist and it's the Enlightenment, therefore it's bad, right? That's the genetic fallacy. You know, and we can't, as Christians, we have to do better than that. We actually have to engage their reasons. There are other legitimate reasons to critique Locke, for instance, as I have, and decide with pre-modern thinkers in one respect. But that's because, you know, I feel like I've actually engaged his argument, right?
Sure.
Like, it's not because he's part of the Enlightenment that he's wrong. It's because I think he's wrong that man isn't a political animal. Like, I think Aristotle's right and Locke is wrong on that score. But then there are other senses in which I'm like, yeah, you know what? Like, I think Locke's conception and Mill's conception of political freedom, like, that has precedent. It's not out of nowhere, and it just becomes what's focused on in the wake of all of these devastating wars in Europe.
Since you've mentioned freedom quite a few times before we get to our last two questions here, how would you address the critique that would from the other side that might go something like this?
All right. Just that point before we go to the false freedom versus true freedom. My gut reaction, and Javier does say that he has in mind like the average like online Christian nationalist commenter. I mean, yeah, we could talk about like the average commenters, I suppose. But I guess from like my perspective as someone who, you know, actually reads some counter Enlightenment type of literature, like De Maistre or like Hamann or Herder, or you know, you could characterize Burke in some ways as counter Enlightenment, or Goethe, or, you know, anyhow, tons of people, Ruskin, etc. You know, I do think there's an amount of like, you have to simplify narratives to some degree to get things across. I know we just made a video on reductionistic narratives and how they can be bad. Like we just made that like what 2 weeks ago or something. But there is an amount of like, you do have to have some sort of simple narrative for communicating things to people. And if a lot of the things that came out of the Enlightenment are bad, it is an easy way to frame things to say kind of like, well, you know, Enlightenment bad, so liberalism bad because it came out of the Enlightenment. I mean, is it like an oversimplistic like framing? Sure. I mean, it is, but like in terms of like communicating things to a very popular level audience, sometimes you do like kind of oversimplify a little bit for the sake of making a point. And I don't think it's like I don't think it's the worst narrative. I think a lot of the bad things about liberalism are related to the Enlightenment sections of it. So like a lot of the ideas about epistemology are related to how they thought about political theory and like origins of government and things like that. I don't have anything more to say. Continue. Yes.
Saying, well, you know what? Freedom in the abstract, this ability to do all of these different things, the ability to pursue even immoral things or things that are not virtuous, that's not true freedom, right? True freedom is obviously living in virtue, which obviously we would actually agree with, right, from a Christian perspective. But how would you address that critique that would say, no, see, but our side is the one that provides true freedom by even if it takes coercion, by making people live virtuously, whereas your side is actually enslaving people by allowing them to engage vice.
Yep. So the response of political liberalism to that is, if you coerce someone into being Christian, right, you sort of set up society such that it's disadvantageous to do anything else. Then they're actually not cultivating true virtue, because true virtue is a discipline of freedom. Which mean, and if it's a discipline of freedom, it's something that the will is trained into. That means it requires repeated acts in which the person grows into that are not coerced. I mean, like, if people have had kids, right, or if you've been a kid, right, and the only reason, like, let's say you had strict parents. I had parents that were fairly strict about grades, like a lot of Indian kids. And like it actually created bad study habits, because the only reason I would study was to get them off my back. And so there's coercion there, which means when I got to college, I actually had to learn. And there's a philosopher named Mark Talbot who's helpful in this, but I actually had to learn how to study because I realized I had no idea. Like, I had just learned enough to get them off my back. And enough to make them think I was doing enough, right? That means I didn't cultivate the virtue of studiousness, because true virtue requires actually uncoerced freedom. And so political freedom actually is securing the conditions for the cultivation of true virtue, because it's saying that the state protects against violations of freedom, and therefore tries to ensure that people aren't coerced into exercising their freedom in particular ways, with, of course, that proviso that you can't exercise your freedom to violate the freedom of another.
So how would one fulfill moral duties from God's word as a...
Any thoughts on that section, or should we just continue?
Yeah, I would just reiterate the point I made earlier that, like, there's certain things that might be worth restricting to actually be able to allow people to freely cultivate virtue. So, like I mentioned, things like getting rid of, defamation or perjury, or like outlawing those things, or even outlawing things like adultery or DUIs or like driving under the influence. Like, if you actually outlaw stuff like that, that actually can help cultivate virtue in a real way, because it allows people to actually freely cultivate virtue. When those things are when those things are allowed and there's no punishment for them, that can actually hinder the freedom of cultivating virtues. And as you pointed out, Seth, earlier, someone could maybe make the argument that, like, well, like, yeah, you can't like, the state shouldn't force people, shouldn't maybe do forced conversions, because, like, there's all sorts of problems with that. But there might be a place where the state might be able to, like, enforce people going to church, because it can put them in the place where where virtue can be cultivated. Like, they can't will themselves to cultivate the virtue, but they can put themselves in a place where God can work on them to maybe create that virtue in them. So, like, there could be an argument for that kind of view, like you were talking about earlier, Seth. So, there's, like, arguments to be had about that. I would be dumbfounded if Sean thought, like, yeah, actually, defamation and perjury and all this and adultery being legal is actually really good for cultivating virtue. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I just think that's obviously wrong. But, that's just me, Tony, a normie.
You were cooking there.
You're not Italian by chance, are you?
No, I am not.
It's a me.
Under Christic liberalism.
Yep. So this is where the non-coercive power of the state becomes really, really important. right? So a Christian magistrate, and this again is where Christic liberalism can't be accused of being an utter novum, because when I'm thinking about the common good, I'm agreeing that the good of a community is ultimately participation in the life of God. And that's where the non-coercive, a Christian who wields the sort of non-coercive power of the state can make a really big difference. So for instance, the magistrate who advocates for the building of a civic center, or the establishment of public art, the commissioning of public art that creates capacities for beauty, or like the magistrate who advocates for the building of, like a Christian homeless shelter or Christian food pantry or something like this, over some other use of funds, like funding Drag Queen Story Hour or something like this. So a Christian magistrate can actually be distinctively Christian when they have their goals of participation in the life of God as a telos. And when they're not thinking about, when they're self-conscious about the fact that, I can't coerce people into this. So then how can I be creative to move society in that direction? That's where the Christian magistrate, I think, can act Christianly.
You want to do this next section on political parties or skip it?
I would like to see the Old Testament government. And
yeah, me too. I'd rather see that part. On the note of political parties, I believe it's I think it's Henry Eyster Jacobs who says that Christians can't join political parties because political parties shift and often don't align with God's word on various points of political theology, and so you can't join parties. I'm not saying he's right or wrong, but I'm just saying that's what Eyster Jacobs. I believe it was Eyster Jacobs who made that point. All right, Old Testament government and coercion.
How would you address, before we close out here, I'll try not to keep us for too much longer. How would you address, as we're talking about, this question just occurred to me as we were talking about coercion and having a biblical basis and all of these things. How would you address the challenge of the other side that says, well, we're just being biblical, right? Look at the Old Testament. Does the Old Testament look like liberalism? The Old Testament seems to be very involved in crushing the places of idolatry and fostering virtue and such. How would you address that challenge?
Yeah, that's cool. It's funny because I think I was in a conversation actually on Facebook, I think with River Devereaux, because he's pointed this out, I think, very helpfully, that there is no way, if we had nothing else, right? Like we didn't have any sort of biblical theological context, there's almost no way to reconcile Jesus's rejection of lex talionis with the Old Testament. Like that's very, very, if you don't have the broader narrative of what's going on. Now, when you do have that broader narrative, what happens? Well, you find that in the form of Israel's existence, and I'm assuming the church is the reconstituted Israel, is Israel resurrected, bears continuity with Old Testament Israel, and is Old Testament Israel gone through the death and resurrection of Jesus. So what is the form of Israel under the new covenant's life in the polis, in the saculum? Well, under the Old Covenant, the form was a theocracy. So I agree. The purpose of Old Covenant Israel was to be an express embodiment of righteousness, full stop. That was the purpose of why God summoned the people into existence. Now, what is the purpose of Israel under the New Covenant? Now, that purpose remained until the advent of the Messiah, and that purpose was fulfilled. And now what is the purpose of the new Israel? Well, our purpose right now is to be an icon of reconciliation. If I'm right about that, that actually explains a lot about why we don't generally hold to lex talionis. And again, it has nothing to do with lex talionis being unjust, of course not. But it has to do with the fact that in this overlap of the ages, our purpose in the world, the way we are to exist as the new Israel, is as an icon of reconciliation in the midst of the nations. So we are no longer a people that's constricted to one place. That's like Palestine it's not that region anymore. It's dispersed through the nations to be the icon of reconciliation to the world. If that's the purpose of our existence, that changes the way we think about our interaction with the law. Given that change of purpose, we no longer emulate Old Testament law in the manner of theocracy. Now, the way it does carry over is that there are certain principles, like there are reasons. There's actually there are dimensions of reality. And I'll recommend a good book on this. Richard Averbeck's book on I think it's like Christ in the Law. He was an Old Testament professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. His book's really helpful here. There are under the New Covenant certain ways we can look back at the Old Testament and say these are what those laws showed about reality. So, for instance, if you stole like something of your neighbor's, right, you were to return it and add a fifth. Well, why is that? Like, what's the underlying principle of justice? Well, it's the principle of compensatory satisfaction, right? If I wrong my neighbor, I'm not just supposed to undo the wrong. I also need to make up for it, make amends for it. And that's why you went above and beyond that. Well, that principle then, that shows me about the nature of justice and the moral order of reality, still applies, right? Like if I wrong my neighbor, if I break my neighbor's like car that they lent me, I probably should actually do something that's just like restoring their car. I need to go above and beyond that. Or if like my neighbor lends me a vacuum and I break the vacuum, right? I shouldn't just get them a new vacuum. I also should actually probably do something more, like take them out to coffee or whatever. So that what the Old Testament law shows us about reality still carries over, even if the particular laws had their purpose and are no longer in place.
So my final question.
All right, Lex Talionis, Talionis. We're Italian ecclesiastical Latinists here. Lex Talionis.
Yeah,
our resident Italian, discuss what's wrong with this, Tony.
Hey, I am also part Italian.
Christian Mario's, let's go.
This is why I make Italian food at home and why my family speaks Italian still, actually.
So I think that what Jesus is mostly getting at there is like, it's something that Paul repeats. I believe it's in Romans 12 or 13, but he talks about how like, revenge belongs to the Lord, or vengeance belongs to the Lord. Like an eye for an eye was a principle embedded in natural law, like we see back in Genesis, where there wasn't like a set up like state of Israel yet. But once that did get set up, the burden of the eye for an eye principle shifted to typically, well, in Israel there's some leeway with it, but typically the state would have that prerogative. And Paul actually argues that God applies vengeance in the world through the state. Like, that's why the state has the sword. He said God appointed the state does not wield the sword in vain. God works through the state to apprehend evil. And so private individuals are not supposed to take that vengeance into their own hands. So like, I, as a private citizen, am not to follow eye for an eye. I shouldn't take revenge against my neighbor who wronged me like that. Instead, I should go through the means I have in my context, like going through the state to try and adjudicate that. Like, that's what I should do. And, or forgive them if they repent, right? And so, like, that's what I should do as a private citizen and as a Christian. So that's what I would say to that. On the second point, like, I think Jesus, well, for example, Jesus says, let what is Caesar's belong to Caesar. On, Sean's Christic Liberalism, why can states enforce paying taxes exactly? Isn't that like, why can they do that on his principle? I mean, another thing is it doesn't seem like Jesus argues against the anti-blasphemy laws, like as in like they can't, like the Jews went to the Roman authorities to like persecute the blasphemers in their community, but it didn't seem like Jesus was like, yes, this law needs to be abolished. Like, yeah, Jesus like acknowledged that he was being wrongfully put on trial, but he never said like the law itself is inherently unjust per se. It's just, like that's something Jesus never uttered. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like, like, I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot wrong with Sean's analysis there. And I mean, yeah, I don't know. It just seems like another thing too is like he's trying to argue from the nature of like what a Christian government ought to be. And I just don't know how he can make those leaps exactly. I don't know. It just seems like it's really hard for him to make his case with all that stuff in mind, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree. Like his entire analysis like proves too much. So like to use your point there at the end, like a lot of theologians used Jesus as like submitting to the government on that sort of thing, right? On the charge of blasphemy is kind of proof that the government actually has authority. Theologians actually have made that point historically speaking. And as you noted, it was on the basis of, him being a public blasphemer, which obviously he was not. But, in theory, it seems like he submitted to the fact that, well, if he was, then, that might have been a, decent, penalty for that sort of thing. But I would say, secondly, when we're like discussing, this point, we would actually even apply this sort of reasoning, where like the state has these powers that are not available to the private citizen, to things like, the right to rebellion outside of an ordered government, right? We would say that, if the, state like slaps you on the cheek, you're to turn the other cheek to them, right? So if you do like live in an absolute monarchy or something, you actually do kind of have to submit to the government and those sorts of things. At least that was historically our position. If you live in an ordered government, then you submit to your lesser magistrate, right? And so like I actually do think we kind of apply this consistently, that Jesus has a interpersonal ethic that applies to certain things. And, through, his inspired instrument of Paul, he has a governmental ethic that applies to what God can do through certain people, right? And God has prerogatives because he owns everything, right? We do not own other people, and God has told us what we can do horizontally, right? And that is to say, we're to treat each other as ends in ourselves, more or less, and we're to essentially be merciful to others and to not seek vengeance. But yeah, like I do think it's telling, as Tony pointed out, if you look at like Romans 12 through 13, like the dynamic is pretty much that like don't take vengeance on each other because vengeance is the Lord's. And it's like, okay, well, is that it? Well, Romans 13 pretty much says that, well, God actually has a mechanism in the here and now of making good on your violations of rights that you've experienced. And that's what he discusses in Romans 13. So I would say in Romans 12, it does seem like it is largely negative rights that are being discussed. But Paul's solution to the negative rights violation thing is much broader, right? That is to say that God has instituted a government that has full power, in a sense, of like adjudicating between, sins and virtues of all sorts, right? And that's the point, is that, Paul is obviously dealing with a very specific, set of disputes, but he makes a point that is broader than those set of disputes.
Yeah, as I mentioned when we read Romans 13 the last stream, Paul even says the government has the right to mandate certain customs of the land are followed, which should be impossible according to Sean's thesis.
The last sections are just why is this mattering, concluding thoughts. I don't necessarily think we need to go through any of that. I mean, it's just gonna be, probably summarizing. Yeah. Anybody have any closing thoughts before we're done?
Only negative thoughts.
I think Javier is a very good interviewer, and his suit looks awesome as well.
Yeah, we love Javier in this channel. We also love Sean Luke. He's a guest, and we love all our guests, and so
Sean Luke is he's you're super smart, Sean, and you've thought out these issues, and you try to be well read, and you're a truth seeker, and that's very commendable, and I praise you for that. You certainly care about finding the truth, and you care about people, and that's something that's extremely admirable. So
yeah. Well, Christians are supposed to run the race, and so we're all racists here because we're all running the race. I'm just gonna end the stream on that note, and I think we're gonna call it a night.
Yeah.
Okay.
These are the racists on Splash.
In that specific sense.